The man wearing what looked like a police uniform stepped out of an SUV and pointed a gun directly at my son in the middle of our neighborhood, while terrified neighbors watched from their driveways. What neither he nor the HOA board understood was that my son had spent years in special forces, and within the next few minutes a routine act of intimidation would explode into a scandal that would leave the entire community speechless. It started on a hot Saturday afternoon when my son had come home to visit after being away for work for several months. He was helping me repair a fence along the edge of my property when an HOA board member named Karen pulled up near the house, accompanied by a man. None of us recognized Karen had been causing problems for years, constantly inventing violations and threatening fines whenever residents disagreed with her. This time, however, she seemed unusually confident. She marched across the lawn carrying a folder and demanded that we stop work immediately, claiming we were violating HOA rules. My son calmly asked her to show the regulation she was referring to, but instead of answering, she signaled to the man standing behind her. He was dressed in tactical style clothing with a badge clipped to his belt, and from a distance he appeared to be law enforcement. Several neighbors stepped outside to watch because they sensed trouble was coming. The stranger began ordering my son away from the property line and insisted he provide identification immediately. Something felt wrong from the beginning. His vehicle had no official markings, and his behavior was far more aggressive than any real officer I had ever encountered. My son remained calm and repeatedly scared for his credentials. But the man ignored the questions. Karen stood nearby with a satisfied smile, as though she had been waiting months for this moment. The argument grew louder and more neighbors gathered outside. Then everything changed in an instant when my son took a step forward to ask another question. The man suddenly pulled out a handgun and pointed it directly at his chest. Gasps erupted from every direction. Several people screamed, and one neighbor immediately grabbed a phone to start recording. Even Karen's expression changed because she clearly hadn't expected the situation to escalate that far. For a few seconds, the entire street seemed frozen. My son didn't panic. He didn't run. He did. And to argue, he simply studied the man carefully while keeping his hands visible. The stranger continued shouting commands and acting as though he had complete authority over the situation. Meanwhile, neighbors began calling emergency services and reporting that an armed man was threatening someone in the neighborhood. What happened next shocked everyone watching, because instead of backing down, my son noticed something about the man's equipment that instantly exposed a serious problem, and the moment he pointed it out, the confidence disappeared from the stranger's face. While Karen suddenly realized the situation was spiraling completely out of control, my son kept his voice calm and controlled as he looked directly at the armed man and pointed out several details that immediately raised questions about who he really was. The badge was positioned incorrectly. Parts of the equipment didn't match standard issue gear, and some of the markings on his clothing appeared to have been purchased from a surplus store rather than issued by any legitimate agent. The man's expression changed the moment those observations were made, because he realized he was dealing with someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. The neighbors watching from their driveways sensed the shift instantly, just moments early. The armed stranger had seemed completely confident, but now he looked uncertain. My son continued speaking in a steady tone, asking him to identify the department he worked for and provide official credentials. The man avoided the questions and instead repeated his demands even louder than before. That only made the situation look worse. By now, multiple residents had called emergency services. Several people were recording from different angles, and the entire confrontation was being captured on video. The HOA board members who had arrived with Karen began quietly stepping away from the scene as if they wanted no part of what was happening. Karen herself looked increasingly nervous because this was no longer a simple HOA dispute. It had become something much more serious. A few minutes later, sound of sirens echoed through the neighborhood. Several marked patrol vehicles entered the street, and officers quickly secured the area. The armed man immediately tried to present himself as law enforcement and started speaking rapidly to the responding officers. But the first thing they asked for was identification and agency credentials. What happened next stunned everyone. The man hesitated. Then he reached for documents, then he changed his explanation. Then he gave another explanation. Every answer seemed different from the last. The responding officers separated everyone involved and began investigating what had actually happened. Witnesses described seeing a firearm pointed directly at my son. Igbers showed the videos they had recorded, and the footage clearly captured key moments of the confrontation. As officers reviewed the recordings, their expressions became more serious. The videos show my son, remaining calm. They showed him asking reasonable questions. They showed the armed man refusing to provide clear answers, and they showed the weapon being pointed during an argument that had started over an HOA complaint. The situation rapidly turned against the stranger. Investigators discovered he was not a police officer from any department operating in the area. In fact, several details about his story began falling apart under even basic scrutiny. Karen looked completely shocked. The confidence she had displayed earlier was gone. She repeatedly insisted she believed the man had authority and claimed he had represented himself as someone capable of enforcing HOA matters. But investigators wanted to know why an armed individual had been brought into a neighborhood dispute. In the first place, that question became the center of the investigation. More witnesses came forward, more recordings surfaced, more details emerged. Residents described previous incidents where Karen had attempted to intimidate homeowners during disagreements over rules and violations. Several people claimed they had felt pressured or threatened in the past but never reported it because they didn't think anyone would listen. Now everyone was talking. The community meeting held a few days later was packed whole. Homeowners filled every seat and lined the walls. Many wanted answers. Others wanted accountability. Nearly everyone wanted to know how a disagreement over HOA rules had escalated into an armed confrontation involving a man who appeared to be impersonating authority. The videos were impossible to ignore. People watched as the events unfolded, exactly as witnesses had described them. The room became silent, then angry, then determined. Questions were directed at the HOA board members, distanced themselves from Karen's actions. Several stated they had not approved bringing any armed individual to the property. Others admitted they were unaware of the plan. Altogether, the fallout spread quickly. Investigators continued reviewing evidence and examining the circumstances surrounding the incident. Meanwhile, my son returned to his normal routine. Many neighbors stopped by to thank him for remaining calm during a situation that could have ended very differently. Several said they believed his experience and training had prevented panic from making things worse. Weeks later, the conclusions became clear. The armed man's actions triggered serious consequences. The investigation resulted in multiple findings that exposed misconduct and raised significant legal concerns. Karen's position within the HOA became increasingly difficult to defend as residents demanded changes. The same authority she had relied upon for years suddenly disappeared. By the time everything was over, the neighborhood had learned a lesson. Nobody would forget power without accountability can become dangerous. Assumptions can create chaos, and intimidation has a way of collapsing when facts finally come to light. Standing in the yard one evening, I looked at my son and thought about how differently the day could have ended. What began as an ordinary afternoon, repairing a fence, had become one of the most talked about events the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen thought she could use fear to get her way. Instead, her actions exposed a problem far bigger than the fence she was complaining about. And the man who thought a gun would give him control ended up losing the very thing he wanted most, the ability to intimidate anyone ever again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We upload new stories every day, and your support helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.